Good afternoon. I'd like to first begin with expressing my profound gratitude to the committee for selecting me for this honor. I am humbled and yes, even intimidated by the presence of so many great minds in this room who I have great respect and regard for. Standing here before you at this moment, I have a sense of what the players of the Elizabethan era must have felt when charged with giving a performance of a new play for the members of the court. I feel much like the mechanicals feel just before they are to give their performance of Pyramus and Thisbe for the court of Athens, thinking, as Peter Quince says, and you should do it too terribly, you would fright the Duchess and the ladies, that they would shriek, and that were enough to hang us all. I promise I will do my best to put a girdle around this topic in 40 minutes. Right up front, I am a staunch Oxfordian, and though I believe that some of the plays in the canon were previously altered or cobbled together by others, nonetheless I view the plays as the windows to Edward's soul. As a director and actor who has engaged artistically with 21 of his titles, plus a staging of Venus and Adonis, it is important to me as an artist to know all I can about this writer's life, to connect to the deeply autobiographical nature of his writing, which I believe supplies the most profound indicators of his hand as the leading hand in these works of art. In the productions which I produce, the artists are not only telling the stories of Hamlet, Oberon and Titania, Bertram and Lear, we are also telling the author's story. Changing the words of the author for whatever reason puts the work at risk of truly becoming someone else's work. It adds a hand to the work that then must be stripped away in order to remain true to the hand of origin. The presence of any additional hand only serves to further obscure the true identity of the author of the Shakespearean canon. And those who seek the truth in this matter then needs must be an opponent to any efforts to add any other hand to the work. The current theme for Shakespeare troupes and festivals trying to develop their audience for the Bard is to present translations, their word, not mine, of Shakespearean texts. Oregon Shakespeare Festival is leading the way. According to their website homepage, their hope is to have 39 unique side-by-side companion translations of Shakespeare's plays that are both performable and extremely useful reference text for both classrooms and productions. The director of the program admits in her own published op-ed piece, February 27th, 2018, that she accidentally fell into this job after a lifetime career in only new plays and works. My entire career has been in the world of new plays, says Lou Dothit, director of the project. Ms. Dothit was brought into the festival administration by now retiring artistic director Bill Rausch to serve as the festival scout and reviewer of new works to be considered for production at OSF. Somehow I ended up at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, she says, which made me laugh. In 4 years of undergraduate school and 8 years of graduate school, I never had a class in Shakespeare, she writes. I rationalized that Shakespeare had been a new playwright once too, and so I have always applied my new play brain to his plays. Is that the issue we are up against? Too many new play brains out there and not enough classical play brains. It may be as simple as that, or it may be that new play brains are indeed the perfect candidates for our message. Look at her profile. Not ingrained into the bardolatry system, willing to embrace something new and different when it comes to Shakespeare. However, she is at risk of becoming a staunch money-making Stratfordian, because here's what happened. A pilot program of 5 plays over 4 years funded by tech wizard Dave Hitz suddenly became a source of revenue to offset the salary of an administrative position at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. As the director of literary development and dramaturgy at the time, this project landed in my lap, she says. What happened next was predictable. Demonstrate to the backer the results of the pilot program and then ask for more money. But it wasn't as simple as that. There was resistance, as there should have been, and I say should still be. But then there was a magnificent PR campaign against the resistance, even promising that these new works would not replace the originals in performance lineup at OSF, which had already reduced its Shakespearean offerings to make room for the new plays that Miss Dothit was originally hired to seek out to fill the season they were designing for their new play brains. The Alabama Shakespeare Festival agreed to break the ice. After their many denials of any plan to produce the translations, OSF couldn't be the first. So helping distance them from the initial live productions was the detail that the writers in the project get to retain copyright and control of their works. The agreement to produce Kenneth Cavender's translation of Timon of Athens was between Cavender and the Alabama Festival. OSF had plausible deniability. But the trend had started, and though OSF said it wasn't their initial intent to perform the works, they were still driving the train with Mr. Hitt's money behind them, and they needed more money in order to fund what quickly became 36 playwrights commissioned to translate 39 titles. And even on that issue, their scholarship is off. Nobody I know ever counts two noble kinsmen, really. Meanwhile, the steam train of translations traveled the country. Pericles at Orlando Shakespeare Theater, The Tempest at Alabama Shakespeare Festival, Two Noble Kinsmen at University of Utah. Well, they can actually have that one. But there are even more productions to come as more titles are completed in what many of the producing theaters are now calling the Hit's Shakespeare Translation Project. But according to Dothit, the project originally was going to be named English to English. As she says, quote, because I wanted people to know that I was aware that Shakespeare's language is early modern English. Exactly. Modern English. No translation necessary unless you are producing the plays at the Beijing Shakespeare Festival. Then I can see the argument. But these venues are most certainly within the English-speaking world. Boston, San Francisco, and guess where else? Yeah. But of course, we said we wouldn't do it. So now that we're going to do it, we're doing one that includes some real foreign language translation, Spanish. And by the way, it's not just us, everybody's doing it. In my view, everybody has subscribed to the belief that somehow after 400 years, the English-speaking world is no longer capable of finding Shakespeare's original works accessible and or enjoyable. We are somehow less intelligent now. Has text speak and Twitter talk corrupted us to such a degree? Or are we truly the new Roman Empire? This writer, our writer, was no Plautus. I didn't want to use the Terence reference, but you get the idea. Shakespeare is the Euripides, or perhaps the Sophocles of his time. I'll look to Earl to answer that question. But our writer is definitely not the Menander of his day. However, under the rules of translation, as defined by OSF's Play On program, he may soon be less. We will explore these rules now momentarily. First, let us take a look at some historical translations of the text to see how they changed the meaning, the beauty, and even our ability to view the identity of the true author within the passages. Here we have the text of Hamlet's famous speech as it is in Quarto 1, version dated 1603. To be or not to be? Aye, there's the point. To die, to sleep, is that all? Aye, all. No, to sleep, to dream. Aye, marry, there it goes. For in that dream of death when we awake and born before an everlasting judge from whence no passenger ever returned, the undiscovered country at whose sight the happy smile in the accursed damned. I won't waste any time going further. There's a reason we call it the bad quarto. And it probably is really a bad actor's translation of the text. In reality, however, the differences between the second quarto and the first folio are so minute that modern editors often converge the two with annotations, of course, but they do this mainly because the differences are so minor that they can be reduced to a few annotations. Or to take arms again in a sea of troubles versus or to take arms against a sea of troubles. Thus, conscience does make cowards versus thus conscience does make cowards of us all. And enterprises of great pitch and moment versus and enterprises of great pith and moment. Only 3 changes to that famous speech, and they're very, very close. Other historical translations include, of course, Nahum Tate's famous King Lear, complete with that happy ending. Most of us Shakespearean actors know it was David Garrick who helped make that popular. Fitting that a man who played a happy Lear also staged the first Shakespeare Jubilee in this famous place in order to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth 5 years too late. But who cares about truth if you're making money? I always found it fitting that it poured rain on that Jubilee, so much so that the Avon River overflowed its banks and flooded out the events. P.S. Not one Shakespearean title was performed as part of the festivities. Then there is, of course, the infamous Coley-Cibber version of Richard III, made famous by who? Oh yes, that's David Garrick. And though he was among the first to alter the works, Garrick wasn't the very first, and he wasn't alone in his quest to make money off of bastardizing the bard. And I use that term deliberately, as it appears to have been William Davenant in 1662, who claimed to be Shakespeare's illegitimate son, when Davenant combined Much Ado About Nothing with Measure for Measure to create a play he called The Law Against Lovers. Other major hits for this Stratford bastard included Macbeth, with all the amendments, additions, alterations, and new songs. Produced in 1663, followed in 1667 by The Tempest or The Enchanted Island, which included a male counterpart to Miranda, sisters to her and Caliban, as well as a female companion to Ariel. Davenant was called upon again 10 years later to assist John Dryden with his translation of Antony and Cleopatra into a play taking place in one single day. Yeah, good luck with that. Those who have called for modern English translations of the works have used terms such as accessibility, familiarity, and even less work. As Lou Dothit described her first experience viewing the translated Timon of Athens, it was a revelatory experience because I wasn't working so hard in the moment of hearing the play. I found myself more engaged, and it was odd not to work that hard. Well, that makes sense coming from someone who never found it important enough to take a single Shakespeare class through her entire secondary education. I know what you're saying. How elitist of me, how aristocratic. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps people, even with minimal Shakespeare scholarship, are in some way actually superior to others through their, wait for it, vocabulary. According to the findings of the Johnson O'Connor Research Foundation, there is a direct correlation between the size of someone's vocabulary and their lifetime income. According to the research of Professor Philip Davis from the University of Liverpool School of English, Shakespeare in its original form also makes you smarter. This should become the topic of a separate presentation, but it's important to note that in their studies, the university scanned the brains of their subjects while they were reading modernized versions of Shakespearean text, and then while reading the original text. They also tested their subjects' brain activity with other classical poetry and modern prose. They found that our author's original text inspired more secondary brain activity than any other writer in the test. And Professor Davis is now looking to use this data to support initiating what he calls poetry treatment, which will most likely become Shakespeare treatment for patients with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. He found that it is the bard's literary inventions, particularly his deliberate syntactic errors, such as changing the part of speech of a word, that actually excites our brains rather than confuses them. Here's an argument for Shakespearean producers. Teach your audience to appreciate Shakespeare as it is written, with all of its antiquated language, and you increase the brain activity as well as expand the vocabulary of your audience, thus helping to increase their earning potential to purchase more tickets to see more shows. Now, depending on which sources, which editions, or which editors you use, our author's works contain approximately 31,500 different and unique words. It's actually 31,534 if you're counting. Some 7,000 of those words he created himself, or at the least put them in print for the very first time. That fact in itself points to a highly educated and successful individual as the author of the works. Modern translators seek to reduce that number of words through their translations by either eliminating those words or converting them into more commonly used words, thus making our writer what? More common than he actually is. Is this not one of the cruxes of the entire authorship question? According to a Google search of a variety of educational sites and intelligence research data, the common English speaker uses approximately 5,000 words in their regular speech, approximately double that in their writing. Still only 1/3 the total words used by our guy, who invented 2,000 more words than most people even know how to use in their daily speech. Now, gaining access to the copies of the new modern translations is not as easy as you might think, even for their educational purposes. As I mentioned, each translator retains the copyright and public licenses for their versions. Many of them have literary agents and publishing agents, and they're shopping their versions with major houses such as Samuel French and Dramatic Publishing. And I received little to no response from my requests to view full copies of those works that have thus been completed in the OSF project. They're very tight-knit. Thankfully, for the sake of this presentation, however, there are a number of excerpts and passages from works in the Play On project which have been published for comparison, which we can review some together. As we explore these, however, I think it's important to understand the process used by the translators in the project. In 2012, Scott Kaiser, director of company development for Oregon Shakespeare Festival, published a very comprehensive set of rules and guidelines used by the OSF commissioned playwrights. Kaiser also dissected certain sections of both the original text and the Kenneth Cavender translated version of Timon of Athens. And here are the rules. Rule 1, translate every line, except those determined to require no alteration whatsoever in order to be understood by an audience, and so they were therefore left untouched. Rule 2, dismiss iambic pentameter if you want to. Although the plays are written as dramatic verse, they are not penned in iambic pentameter, working line by line. The playwright, quote, strives to honor the meaning of each line rather than strictly adhering to Shakespeare's original meter. That in itself is a dreadful mistake. The meter is part of the stage direction given to the actor by the author. He doesn't have to write anything more than exits pursued by a bear because he puts it all in the meter and punctuation, like the crescendos, sustains, and allegros written into music by a composer. Actor scansion of the text could also be an entire presentation on its own, and perhaps Teresa and I can do one together next year. Rule 3, prose is translated sentence by sentence rather than line by line. So here's a taste of some prose. The middle of humanity thou never knewest, but the extremity of both ends. When thou wast in thy guilt and thy perfume, they mocked thee for too much curiosity. In thy rags thou knowest, guess what? I'm supposed to be making a presentation right now. In thy rags thou knowest none but are despised for the contrary. There's a meddler for thee, eat it. Or, your whole life has been all or nothing. You never learned there is a middle ground. When you wallowed in perfumed luxury, people made jokes about your oh-so-delicate feelings, and now that you've lost them and wear rags, you seem just vulgar and pathetic. Here's a prune for you. Eat it. Sound any different? Easier? Less work, perhaps. Less brain activity? Definitely. Rule 4. Punctuation is editor's choice, including modern playwright conventions such as the use of the ellipses. Here we have jeweler. I have a jewel here. Merchant. Oh, pray, let's see't. For the Lord Timon, sir? Or, I have a jewel here, ellipses. Oh, let's see it. Please, ellipses. For Lord Timon, sir? Kaiser attempts to clarify why Cavender uses the ellipses in this section. He writes, in the Cavender version, we see the ellipses used twice, suggesting in both cases dramatic action that involves a lull in speaking. Pace, pace, pace. The first ellipsis signals a delayed cue pickup. as the jeweler presents the jewel to the merchant. The second ellipses indicates an internal pause as the merchant examines the jewel. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. In the original text, we see that the merchant is anxious to see the jewel, which is why he completes the line of verse. Whoops. Here we go. Which is why he completes the line of verse. The author also indicates through the writing that the jeweler emphasizes the value of the jewel by using both syllables of the word jewel in order to register the correct 10 beats in the shared line. So it reads, I have a jewel here, oh pray let's see it, and on the caesura, at the period there after here, is when the merchant snatches the jewel in his angst to see it. It's only then is there a pause for him to examine it and say, for the Lord Timon, sir. Cavender has it completely wrong. Cavender has not only changed the lines, but he has changed the author's instruction to the actors on how the lines should be delivered, as well as what the action should be during or on the lines. Here's another example, this time in prose, where Cupid introduces the 5 senses to freeloaders enjoying a banquet at Timon's house. Hail to thee, worthy Timon, and to all that of his bounties taste. The 5 best senses acknowledge thee, their patron, and come freely to gratulate thy plenteous bosom. There, taste, touch all, pleased from thy table rise. They only now come but to feast thine eyes. Or, hail to you, worthy Timon, and to all who savor the feast he provides. Ellipses. The 5 senses salute their patron and gratefully honor your unstinting hospitality. I will now present, ellipses, taste, ellipses, touch, ellipses, and the rest of them. Please rise, everyone, ellipses. You have been well fed, so now a second feast, ellipses, for your eyes only. Kaiser says, note how Cavender uses the ellipses in translating this passage to suggest theatrical action or nonverbal moments. Here we can see that Cavender uses the ellipses as an implied stage direction indicating the entrance of each of the sentences and the rising of the banqueters. Wrong again. And completely against the scansion of the prose, which is really hard to do unless you're William Shatner. I will now present, taste, touch, and the rest of them. In Elizabethan theater, the players were all presented at once, as any prologue or dumb show was then to describe them. For instance, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the mechanicals all appear before the Duke and company as Peter Quince delivers the prologue saying, "Gentles, perhaps you wonder at this show." Why do they wonder? There are 5 strange, weird-looking dressed people in front of them, not one at a time. Wrong. It's wrong. Rule 5. All pronouns and verbs are modernized. Thou becomes you, thine becomes your, thee becomes you, wilt not becomes won't, thou art becomes your, and thou dost becomes you do. What am I going to say? Wrong again. The author makes very specific use of the difference between these pronouns and how they relate to the meter. Some characters refer to other characters with these and thous in a somewhat classicist, condescending manner. With other characters, they use you and your in their speech. This informs the actor about the particular regard a character has or does not have for certain other characters. This also works with names in Shakespeare. For example, if you scan the meter of the lines in Romeo and Juliet, you will find that some characters say Romeo, and other characters say Romeo. The people who are most familiar with Romeo refer to him as Romeo. The people who are not refer to him as Romeo. Just like some people call me Steve and other people call me Stephen. Duh. But, ellipses. Rule 6, obsolete words are changed into words of modern use. Kaiser says, yes, if a word has fallen into disuse since Shakespeare's time, the translator changes it to a word we will instantly understand. And here is an example. Immortal gods, I crave no pelf, I pray from no man but myself. Or, immortal gods, I don't lust after wealth, I pray for no man but myself. Kaiser points out that pelf means riches or goods, and it is used thrice in Shakespeare's works, in Timon, Pericles, and in The Passionate Pilgrim. But here he says, this is a direct quote, it, quote, hobbles the rhymed couplet, end quote. So it is substituted with a near rhyme, wealth. We're now down to 31,499 words. Perhaps their goal is to reduce Shakespeare's vocabulary down to 10,000 written words. Pelf is sacrificed. Never mind that it helps us connect 3 Shakespearean works to the same author. Nope, it's gone. Here's another example. Here, Kaiser states, the modern ear gets stuck on satiety, which means excess or overabundance, and unclue, which means unwind, undo, or ruin. He calls the substitutions, quote, modern equivalents, but they are not equivalents, are they? Satiety and superfluity are not the same thing. Worse yet is comparing unclue to drain. Completely different terms creating completely different mental images in the mind. I can unclue a Stratfordian argument in favor of Shakespeare, but I cannot drain the finances of the Birthplace Trust backing up their arguments. And yet another example, because I happen to think this rule of changing obsolete words is one of the most damaging to our author and our society, for that matter. And now I remember, my lord, you gave good words the other day of a bay courser I rode on. 'Tis yours because you liked it. Now that I think of it, my lord, the other day you admired a bay stallion I was riding. You liked it. It is yours. I'm not certain why Cavender decides to put these lines into verse form here. Poetic license, I guess. But courser, as used by the bard, implies the horse to be fast and sure of foot, while stallion, used by Cavender, merely pertains to the gender of the horse. It is a male horse. It does not describe any attribute of the animal which one might covet. Did Shakespeare imply the horse was male? No. He did, however, imply the horse was fast. Big difference. Rule 7, avoid false friends. Here, Kaiser attempts to redefine the term false friends, which usually refers to similar words in different languages. Instead, he uses it to describe English words and phrases. He says, quote, we think we understand, but whose obsolete meanings mislead us. Apparently, part of the goal of this project is to dictate to the audience what they can and cannot understand, or to assume ignorance, perhaps even to propagate ignorance, or at the least, sloth. I could have used laziness, but it didn't paint the mental image I was going for. Here's the application of the rule. Had I a steward so true, so just, and now so comfortable? Did I have a steward so true, so honest, and now so kind? Kaiser argues that comfortable in this context, meaning comforting, encouraging, or reassuring, would be mistaken by modern audiences to mean merely well off. He states, Cavender makes Shakespeare's intended meaning clear through translation. Wait a minute. Shakespeare's intended meaning. A man who used more than 30,000 different words, each in their very specific place, had a different intended meaning that we need modern playwrights to interpret for us? Who's the elitist now? Here's another example. Traffic's thy God, and thy God confound thee. Or, business is your God, and may your God ruin you. The meaning of traffic here is obviously trade. Commerce, business, merchandise, like the famous song from Annie, Get Your Gun. There's no business like show business. It contains the lyric, everything about it is appealing, everything the traffic will allow. But Kaiser says, today we still hear about drug trafficking, which is about as close as we get to the meaning expressed here. Apparently, our doped-up society can only understand the word trafficking if it's being used in drug terms. That leads me to Rule 8. Expletives and exclamations are modernized to use current curse words. I must be round with him now he comes from hunting. Fie, 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 fie! Or, I'll have to level with him, ellipses. Here he is, home from the hunt, ellipses. Damn, 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 damn. Except that fie represents disgust or disapproval and is an exasperation, while damn represents authoritarian condemnation. Words, my friend. Words, words, words. Rule 9. Insults are also modernized, you flap-eared knave. Apomantus says, thou art the cap of all fools alive. You are the crowning glory of all idiots. Yes, they are. The first passage clearly uses the imagery of a classic fool and the classic fool's cap, perhaps even with tassels and bells attached, whereas a crown is clearly a completely different image. If the bard had wanted him to be called the king of fools, he would have written that, but he clearly did not want to make any reference to royalty here. Then there is this segment to review, and I'll ask you to indulge me. Listen to the bard's words while you follow along with the translation. Matrons turn incontinent. Obedience fail in children. Slaves and fools pluck the grave-wrinkled senate from the bench and minister in their steads. To general filth, converted the instant green virginity. Do it in your parents' eyes. Bankrupts, hold fast rather than render back. Out with your knives and cut your trusters' throats. Bound servants steal, large-handed robbers your grave masters are, and pill by law. Maid to the master's bed, thy mistress is of the brothel. Son of 16, pluck the lined crutch from thy old limping sire, with it beat out his brains. Is this opera? Does Shakespeare require super titles? Kaiser makes this argument. Though much of this tirade is perfectly clear without amendment, Cavender's translation restores much of the shock value of the curses by making the long chain of maledictions completely comprehensible. Perfectly clear without amendment. Stop. Stop. Yet restores much of the shock value. Again, are we seeking to convert Shakespeare to Menander? Ah, Rome. And speaking of Rome, Latin phrases are replaced, because after all, we all know that Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek. And this rule flat out destroys me. Classical allusions are eradicated. Yes. Yes. Look here. In this translation, hymen becomes marriage, Mars becomes seducer, and Diane becomes a virgin. Not the eternal and immortal goddess, but just any virgin who happens to keep a pile of fresh snow in her lap. But for those who have any knowledge of these deities, when they are invoked in this way, they paint a very visual picture of the gods themselves, whether it be through an image in our minds of a sculpture or painting or tapestry that we have seen, or that the author himself may have seen, perhaps even during his travels to Italy. I think you're with me now. But let's not forget, Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek. Rule 12, yes, 12. It's almost over. Sentences determined to be too dense, that's their word, receive an overhaul. This is more of the ignore the meter aspect of the translations. Best state contentless hath a distracted and most wretched being, worse than worst, the content. The rich are never satisfied, they live distracted in the land of not enough. The lowest of the low, they are content. The land of not enough. That's a brand new creation that cannot in any way be attributed to our author. It is rather a creation of this translator who decides here to try his own hand at neologism. Shakespeare created many words and many worlds. The land of not enough was not one of them. And here's another. Kaiser says here about this particular translation that in general, Cavender tries to honor figures of rhetoric and wordplay as much as possible, but that in this example, the poet is trying to impress the painter with a lofty description of his latest work dedicated to Timon. Well, yes, he's a poet. He says, though, unfortunately, the poet's language is so pretentious, so impenetrable, so dense, it leaves most modern listeners in a state of utter bewilderment. Isn't that the entire point? Sometimes our author wants the audience to be confused by the words of the character. Sometimes it is a character trait that the character speaks larger than life or uses classical allusions, or in some cases, the most humorous of cases, as in Dogberry in Much Ado or Bottom in Midsummer, the character attempts to use words that are larger than their own minds. And the malapropisms become the gist of the jokes. Finally, Rule 13, rhymed couplets remain unless the translator wants to create their own instead. Here's my favorite example. Go, I charge thee, invite them all, let in the tide. You see it here, right? I don't know why the lines had to be changed at all, except for to follow Rule 1, which is change every line. But you see here, the caesura in the second line, the colon in the second line, informs us that the rhymed couplet is not meant to be emphasized. The actor is instructed by, am I on the right one here? Wait a minute. Yes. Yes, see the colon there? Of knaves once more, colon, action point, change in thought, change in direction of the actor. Then my cook and I'll provide. The actor is instructed by the broken line to make a change there. The translation disregards the stage direction and emphasizes the rhyme instead. The delivery is now, just for the sake of changing every line, the delivery is now completely different, and therefore the mind of the speaker is now completely different as well. There's no exasperation of him, let them in, which is what Shakespeare's telling the actor to feel and do here. And so now let us review our 13 rules of translation in all of their crowned glory. And let us look at a few other translations from plays in the project. Here, this one from Macbeth. Not only changes the words, but it also changes the dialect of the speaker, who is a captain in the Scottish army. His words are specifically designed to depict his station, his level of education, his demeanor, and his life as a soldier. Would you translate the characters in a Mark Twain novel to eliminate their Mississippi River dialect? Of course not. This next piece, from Measure for Measure, the speaker is the Duke Vincentio, who, even though he is conceding to Aeschylus his inability to offer him better advice than his own, it is somewhat sarcastic in that the Duke uses such high language in his concession. That's the author's point here, a mechanism he uses time and again, even to the point that the character in the canon thought to be the most brutish is in fact the most eloquent speaker of them all, Othello. If in translation we make Othello sound just as plain as everyone else, then we do a disservice to the character, the play, the actor, the author, and indeed the audience. Here in this example, there can hardly be any true reason for making any of these changes except for the sheer purpose of following change rule number 1. Translate every line. We gain nothing, and instead lose much in the imagery and once again the style of speech of who? I don't know, the title character? That's not important, I guess. Macbeth himself. So here are some modern translations of my own. Here we go. As you can see, my colors are clearer, stronger, easier to define, sharper and more vivid, making the solitary white iris appear now bloody pink in her difference from the purple crowd, which I believe was what Van Gogh actually intended. Because if we can translate one type of artistic expression, why not all forms of art? Here's another that I like much better, and I think you will all agree that it is a stark improvement. Here's one from our favorite friend, James Shapiro, who has condemned the idea of translation and whom with we can actually agree, at least on this one issue. Then, of course, there is this very famous translation from history, which proves that our translators are not alone in their efforts to make Shakespeare something he is not. I believe that it is obvious that the drive behind this effort is fueled by money, not unlike the drive behind maintaining the These translators have been commissioned, their loyalty to the cause purchased with a millionaire's dollars. It is, in effect, something like a £1,000 annuity that must be accounted for through performances of the translated texts. Their own form of propaganda aimed at selling tickets. We get it. People are losing their taste for going to see Shakespeare. Something has to be done to change that. Changing the text to make it more accessible or less work is not the answer. But in fact, it could be the absolute last thing that should be done according to the research by Professor Davis and the Johnson O'Connor Research Foundation. This is why I believe Oxfordians need to be targeting our message to theatrical producers, directors, and even high school educators. These are the key people we need to assist us in sharing the truth with the rest of society. And I believe as they discover the ways in which Edward's life is so undeniably sewn through the fabric of these works, revealing them to be the threads of this magnificent tapestry of a life that they are, then perhaps they turn away from translations, and instead the authorship question is what is going to make Shakespeare new again for them and for their audiences. I saw Pericles at OSF, I believe with many of you in this room at that year's conference. Pericles, an obscure title, hardly ever produced. I've read it. I've critiqued it, but when I saw it performed before me, I wanted to weep at how beautiful the story is, because I connected with my knowledge of how it relates to Edward's life, and I felt a new empathy for Pericles, which I had never experienced before. Plays such as Pericles and A Winter's Tale, All's Well That Ends Well, and Measure for Measure, which each deal in some way with Edward's relationship with his wife and daughter, for instance. These plays can experience a new resurgence for theaters across the country if those theaters include this aspect of the experience added to their season through lectures, workshops, and audience discussions, even if to only ask the question, does this man's life inform this work of art? Does the play have any more meaning to you now having seen it with this information accessible to you? And I say it does. In the meantime, while we still try to spread this message, we are left with yet another quote from Peter Quince. And I will return to where I started. Bless thee, Oxford, thou art translated. Thank you.